Good morning. Looks like this is going to be a small and intimate audience. I was warned that if the seats are comfortable, my first challenge is to make sure nobody falls asleep. Shomena, will I have a feedback loop or you'll signal me? Okay. How many of you heard of somebody called Abraham Wald? Okay. Anyone here? Abraham was a mathematician, and one of the things I really liked in reading his life history, because I'm at least a passionate amateur when it comes to mathematics, was some work that he was doing in designing how fighter planes would be built. And some of the data he was using to deal with that was looking at the planes that were coming back and the patterns of where they were shot. But what he did, which I think is really important for us, was having spent some time looking at the fighter planes and where the bullet patterns were, he was the first guy to say, can we reinforce the places where there are no bullet holes? Until then, the industry was about reinforcing the places that had the bullet holes. The insight that he gave was that the planes who were shot in the places that had no bullet holes weren't coming back. So the reinforcing was needed there. Okay? When we look at social media, when we look at technology in society, it's not that the things aren't happening, but what helps sometimes is to have a fresh perspective. Okay? There are many new things that are going on in this world right now. My favorite definition of a teenager. You people know what a teenager is. There are still some around, and they exist. They're unusual creatures. I have 3 of them, but when you get to know them, they're pretty good. And my favorite definition of a teenager is somebody who can send a text message without taking their hand out of their pocket. Okay? When I'm traveling in a lift and I can hear a clickety-clack, but the children's faces are completely stable and you don't know which one is sending the message and how they're doing it. Okay, so we live in a world where the term even used to describe the generation is changing, is under deep debate. For many years, we used terms like immigrant and native to describe the digital age. And more recently, the academic theory behind that is switching us to thinking we should be talking about visitors and residents. That there are some people comfortable enough in cyberspace to consider it where they are, an extension of their psyche, they're comfortable, whereas others go in there and come out as quickly as possible. So when you think about who you are in that space and how you have to deliver services, one of the keys is even to have the terminology about explaining your perception of that environment. This new generation has new values. I can never understand why some of my children were happy to pay up to $5 for a ringtone and not pay $10 for a CD. Right? The value proposition was so different for me. But the truth is, it's a renting generation. Music is being streamed, the films are being streamed, bikes are being rented, cars are being rented. The concept of ownership is less there for that generation. The environment they operate in is fundamentally different. If you take something like Facebook, right, Facebook would not exist unless the mobile phone had a camera in it. Because the whole concept actually took its energy from being able to share the social object, which I shall come to, of a photograph, and have people comment on it, tag it, be part of the community. Because those photographs, if you actually understand what's happening in Facebook, that site uploads a flicker close to once every 4 weeks, okay, in terms of sheer volume of photographs. That's important to bear in mind. But that environment is such that our life, this week, it would be 40 years since the first email was sent. Okay? Now, we're reaching a stage where, while it may be 40 years since that email was sent, the volume of messages that take place in social networks outstripped that of email in September 2009. We live in a post-PC world. So the devices we're used to that were born out of the 40s and 50s and designed during the late 60s and then made commercial in the mid-1980s to be with us, this PC, is not just dead. I mean, at Salesforce, we bought a company called Heroku. And one of the first things you notice when you go to Heroku offices is there are no desks. It's quite difficult to have a desktop when you don't have a desk. Okay? And the culture has changed because you're now working with devices that are wireless at any angle. The offices themselves start looking at as a hybrid between an airport lounge and Starbucks. Okay? You don't have these regulated desks. And it's there for a reason, because work itself is changing. Okay? Work is now about knowledge workers. And knowledge work is lumpy. Right? It's not so many parts per thousand or per million coming across you as a straight stream. It's much more like a sine curve. You cannot predict what volume of complaints you're going to get in a given minute or hour. You cannot predict how you work within creative aspects of any part of knowledge work because it's not an assembly line business. But we're scared of it. Why are we scared of it? How do I know we're scared of it? Well, I've been in that business for 31 years. And I tried to figure out why I don't see the troughs. You see, a policeman has a trough, a time when they've got nothing to do. A fireman has a trough, a nurse has a trough, a doctor or surgeon has a trough. Why do all knowledge workers not have one? I'll tell you why. Because we fill that space with something we have made peculiar to our own generation. When the world looks back on us and says, what did we give? Time immemorial, they're going to say meetings. Okay? Because meetings allow you to look busy without achieving anything in particular. Because then, when something real happens, you have to do it at the end of the day and work overtime. There's something flawed about this, and the new generation is less comfortable with taking that. So the technology is changing because we've got mobile phones, we've got social networks, we've got we've gone away from email, we've gone away from the PC. The generation has changed. The way we work has changed. But what is really changing, which is what I want to spend the rest of this talk about to try and excite you with what's happening right now, is that the environment is going through the most fundamental changes I could ever imagine, and that is through the use of what a guy called Yuri Engstrom calls social objects. Right? When people talk to people, they share things that they feel they're going to have in common in order to build bonds to deal with the things they don't have in common. So when you meet at a water cooler, it's always about what you ate last night or the film you watched or the game that was on or some news event that took place, not because that's important, but it's because by talking about it, you can build relationship. Right? Life is about relationship before conversation, before transaction, because now the technology allows us to do that. It's what life used to be before the broadcast generation wasted 50 years of our lives by having controlled, channeled, unidirectional statements. Now it's become interactive again. We're social animals, but we have the tools in our hands to be able to do that interacting. Our use of social objects is far different from any previous generations because for us, these objects are persisted, they can be archived, they can be commented upon, tagged, analyzed, they can be retrieved at will, they're usually full context searchable, and they're embedded in a way that no previous generation has been able to do because we have very, very cheap metadata associated with the objects. Right? Now, automatically, because of the nature of the devices we have, the date and time of the event, whether you're recording it in sound or video or image, is auto-recorded. The location is usually captured. Your identity is usually associated with it. The identity of other people who may have linked to it, followed it around, tagged it, annotated it, enriched it, even tried to delete it. Right? All these things are available to you in ways that you couldn't before. So now, when you deal with the sharing of digital social objects, those objects are actually not just the physical that we used to have. Jean-Bernard did not mention I'm a retiring hippie. And one of the sites I really enjoy is a site called songmeanings.net. Okay? It's a very, very simple site. All it does is provide you the lyrics of songs from the late 60s and early 70s, my time. And the conversations are about what those lyrics mean. Right? And you can imagine, because the nature of the psychedelic writings, how do you put real deep psychological context into Jeremiah was a bullfrog? Okay? But people did. People wrote the most amazing things, and the relationships came from that, because I remember hearing about a deep intonation during a couple of Doors songs called Mr. Mojo Rising. And this incantation kept on going. And there were theses being written about the advent of voodoo into Doors music and how Jim Morrison followed magic and Caribbean tools within that, etc., until a little old lady wrote into the debate and said, I don't know what you're talking about. The Morrisons were next-door neighbors of ours, and little James used to play, little Jimmy played, and my husband came up with a nickname based on an anagram of Jim Morrison, and that was Mr. Mojo Rising. Okay? Rising without the G. So the site was about community, and whenever we do it, when you design, for example, a good art exhibition or you design a good bar, people tend to look at something side by side because it's less threatening. When you're sitting at a bar, you make conversation because you're side by side. Face-to-face is more antagonistic. It's more sort of confrontational. So when we have social objects, we can come alongside each other in a digital world, have a conversation, share something, not because that something is important. The something is just a catalyst. That world we're dealing with social objects has become exciting in ways that I cannot imagine. I have never imagined before, and every day I get surprised. We've lived through a generation where, how many of you use a Foursquare or a Gowalla? Okay, not too bad. Now, when you start doing things like checking in and providing activity streams, these are actually bases for future work, for new businesses, for how these sort of social tools are going to enter the enterprise, because the value of what is embedded within the activity stream is the magic. But to do that, we need to build a map of what is there. Right? We need to be able to associate a GPS location with a label. And not just with a label, but with annotation saying that, you don't get a phone signal here. Be careful, there are slippery stairs when you go to this restaurant. The things that the reviews normally won't tell you, you can now associate in contextual terms with a GPS location. That kind of mapping, you can think of Google as saying they laid out a map of documents. How many of you are familiar with a service called Shazam? Okay, much better. Now, when I first saw Shazam, I desperately wanted to have Shazam for birds and trees. I wanted to be able to point to a bird and say, tell me what it is. Look at a plant or a tree and say, tell me what it is. You know what? It's available now. Because the concept of augmented reality through the smartness of our devices with the metadata available allows me to do something like go to LeafSnap if you're interested. LeafSnap covers Washington State in America, and every single plant there has been recorded and annotated so that you take a photograph, it returns the data. Okay? MealSnap is a bit of a bitch in comparison. It tells you how many calories the food you're eating on your plate is. Not everybody wants that feedback. Okay? But I also see maps of the world as seen through the perspective of 60s and 70s record albums. Okay? Every single photograph of a 60s or 70s record that had a physical location on it has been mapped. So there are people who are taking all kinds of digital objects and mapping them. We're able to do that at home and at work in ways that you could not see, because the creativity comes from not even knowing how someone else is going to use the data you're creating. When we deal with that revolution of consumerization, because one of the bigger changes that has taken place during my lifetime is when I was growing up, you got to play with toys when you were in your early to late 30s. You worked for aerospace or defense or high-end manufacturing or investment banking, and you played with toys. You were usually male, probably white, but not necessarily. And in the last 40 years, what has changed is now the experimenters with new technology are the kids. They're the 14 to 22 type generation. And what that inversion has done is bring what people call consumerization into the enterprise world. And where I spend my time, where Salesforce is spending its time, is in trying to understand what the value proposition is when you take this new generation, the new tools, the new environment, the ability to capture context as cheaply, and then embed that at work. And we found it's relatively simple to start with, but it's a pioneering time. The social enterprise is actually about a renaissance, a relationship between the customer and business in ways that you could not achieve before because the technology wasn't there. You need to have a 360 view of the customer to be able to do that. But the tools didn't exist before. Today, they do. The cost of actually figuring out what the customer wants, rather than looking at the reflection of the moon in the water and believing it's the sun, sampling is no longer required. You can know the answer. Intentions can be signaled by customers and captured and acted on. Real intentions in real time with enough data augmenting it to be able to execute. Right? That is the brilliance of the future we're in. That we're not talking about having to take samples and estimates of things. The cost of actually aggregating the data is low. The data is personalized. You know, people talk to me about saying the house has been changed. When I was at BT, we were talking about how, you know, if you have a landline at home, the phone rings and your children just walk by as if it's got nothing to do with them. And it's true. It has nothing to do with them because they have no relationship with the landline. When you deal with television, it's fragmented again because the household sitting around the TV screen doesn't happen. People are watching their own thing. But I'm going to end with reminding you that it's a lie to say that they have become individual. What has really happened is that the physical households that were analog constraints on what we did have moved to logical households. Now my children still watch television, but they're watching it with their friends, despite their friends being in different physical locations. They're able to converse with their friends exactly as if they were in the living room. They're able to share it. They don't miss conversation because it's persisted. It's asynchronous. You don't physically even have to be there to have it. And because it's persistent, it can also be retrieved at will. It can, you know, you can do that in your time. This ability to shift space and shift time while embedding who you are and what you think about and what you want and what you'd like to be around irrelevant social objects, but rolling stones that gather moss. And it is that moss that gives you information about what somebody wants, needs, in ways where new problems exist. New problems to do with privacy, with confidentiality, with opting in, with a right to be forgotten, with dealing with indiscretion. These are all good problems to have because they are new. They are problems of growth. They're not problems of trying to figure out how to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear or put lipstick on a pig. Right? They are genuine new problems, and we will continue to face them because we are in a completely new world. That new world of being able to understand the customer in the full 360 context of the social networks they're in, because that's where they spend their time, with the ability for that customer to express what they want, with the ability for things to tweet, so that you don't just follow people, you can follow an order, you can follow a bill, you can follow a company, you can follow a complaint. Because anything that is capable of putting out an alert can be followed. Life is moving to a publish-subscribe environment with a bus or many buses onto which the things are published, and the subscriber has the power to choose what to listen to. Right? Unlike the mess of email where the power was in the sender, we're living in a world where power is in the recipient. You choose to follow people. You choose to buy something from a company. You choose to have a relationship. Those choices, with the technology we have, with ubiquitous connectivity, with persistent access, with search, with the community capability to enhance, living in a world where augmented reality is reality, because I can draw data from the cloud and place it on top. And all I have to do to start getting this world going is to make sure that my people, and wherever I am, are in one or more social networks, that the ability to share is provided, that those social networks do not stop within the company environment or the school or the home environment, because that's meaningless. You must be inclusive of everyone around you. That the network we operate in has nodes that are not people, because everything has this capacity to record, to respond. That world can transform social lives, it can transform healthcare, it can transform education, it can transform government as we know it. But it is only going to transform if people like us act as pioneers and figure out what are the implications for privacy, for confidentiality, for social mores. You see, I hear new things that I never heard before. When you're on a phone call, you hear the phrase, "Are you still there?" Okay? Because on a landline, you didn't have this expected high drop rate. So the only reason you would actually acknowledge anything in a landline conversation is, yeah, and that was an knack, just to say you're around. But modern generations don't do that, which means now that we have the mobile phone, if something goes silent for a while, you ask, are you still there? Because you have to wonder how long you've been talking to nothing, okay? And before I get to the stage, before I wonder how long I'm talking to nothing, when I can still hear people laugh and smile, thank you for your time.
JP, I'm sure we're going to have plenty of questions from the audience, so maybe if you give us the courtesy of staying a few more minutes. Any direct question from the audience? I have one ready for you. When you're in your presentation, I live with the impression that the customers is really in power. The social networks give them a lot of information, feedback, etc. How does a company today take advantage of this social network? We have CIOs, we have entrepreneurs, we have... how do we, as a CEO, as a CIO, take advantage of the social network so the power is not only one-sided?
Okay. One of my favorite books, a book which I had the privilege of writing an additional chapter in its 10th anniversary edition, is one called The Clue Train Manifesto, which at the turn of the last century was a bestseller in business terms. And one of the most important phrases in that was something called markets are conversations. So the first message to people in enterprise is, if you understand that markets are conversations, then you understand that the market has moved to where the conversation is taking place. That conversation, those conversations your customers are in, are taking place in social networks. I hear of many companies which say, ban Facebook, but advertise on it. And I'm thinking, make your mind up. Is this good or is this bad? Because if it's good enough for your customer, then at least be part of what's happening with the social network. That requires you to actually empower your staff, your customers, your trading partners. The entire supply and trading chain are part of that network. That one step gets you going, but it helps, when you have a friend. The friend doesn't consider you to be a friend if you don't have an idea of who he or she is. If you can't remember what they like, if you don't know their names. I mean, there are simple social rules about how relationships happen. And for the last 50, 60 years, because we've been in this broadcast mindset, we haven't cared about relationships. Now we can do something. And it's important to know, especially when the cost of that knowledge is low. So all you really have to do is have the profile of the people you're dealing with, because it's easy to do so. Empower people on both sides of the equation to be part of networks. And then you don't have to be too prescriptive, because your customer will work it out. And if you don't do this, the company that's already making waves in the social networks will make sure you're history.
Hi, good morning. I enjoyed your speech very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question about leadership. Do you think that organizations have the leadership to jump into this social world, especially when we see more and more signs of this whole counter culture, right? Where we see Occupy Wall Street, where we see the riots in London, where they were also using social media to organize against the establishment. So do you see the leadership embracing it, or are they afraid?
Well, I've been tracking the use of social. I mean, the seminal book on sort of social media and the enterprise is called Enterprise 2.0, written by Andy McAfee, then of Harvard, now of MIT. And he used my department at the bank I was CIO at as the exemplar for the first 5 case studies. I've tracked that market for the last 7 years, and the first lesson I learned is that the implementation of this in leadership terms is actually a pincer movement. You need to have benevolent despoty from the top. The leaders have to at least believe in it to give a blessing to what is happening, but the real action comes from the grassroots because it's emergent behavior, it's not prescriptive rules. There is fear because it's a control environment that is quite different from anything that most CEOs have seen. But if you remember that business itself has morphed from being hierarchies of product and customer to networks of relationships and capabilities, then you understand a network is managed differently from a hierarchy. Not that the hierarchy goes away, but now a hierarchy may set priorities, but allow emergent behavior in the so-called HR aspects of choosing your team or selecting the mission or quest you want to go. It's closer to a video game because the tools are there for low-cost discovery of the right skills. You don't need to do Myers-Briggs and Belbin and whatever else to figure out how to create teams. You're actually able to say, you know what, meet the people, talk to each other, figure it out. You'll know who you're going to work with. So this kind of emergent behavior for task selection and resource management in the environment of very strong values set by leadership. Leadership starts becoming a lot about values and brand and what you stand for and setting an environment. Because I've always asked myself, why the hell would you hire a smart person and then tell him what to do? Okay? You might as well automate. So if you've got smart people and they're our best resource, you want to create, an environment, grid lines, an enabling environment where people can express the talent that they have, the differentiated talent they have, but they must know what you stand for. They must know what your values and ethics are. They must know what your brand means. But this brand is also now embedded in the social network. So going back to Jean-Bernard's question, CEOs have to realize the customer has escaped. They are not in your prison anymore. And where advertising used to be, will you walk into my parlor, it has changed to, may I please walk into your parlor? And you have to learn the rules and conventions of customer space now. And customers, one of the not nice things about social networks, when you misbehave, you will find out very quickly.
Hi, I'm Eric Amram, Evenium. Hi. Companies have been struggling for years to manage their customer database inside, and now the social networks have disrupted the notion of CRM, meaning that it's no more an internal thing to the enterprise, but it has blurred the border, the frontier of the enterprise. What is for you the inside and the outside of a company today? And a next question is for you, do you see in a B2B situation a person as a business executive, for instance, as an individual or as a position?
Okay, I'll answer the second question first.
Okay.
I think that the concept of B2B is under severe stress because what actually happens is that everything has to be aligned up with the true end customer. So you land up with chains, we start looking at B2B2C or B2B to B2B2C, etc. You have to trace whatever any company or group of companies does down to the fact that at the end of the chain, there is somebody paying you money or time or other resource for an exchange of value. And unless you design things for that end customer, I wrote about the sad passing of Steve Jobs last week, and I ran a secret project to convert many of the systems in my bank from Microsoft to Apple. That project was called Jobsworth, which is why Jobsworth is my Twitter handle. And I wondered when I was going to meet him when I was running this project. And somebody took me aside and said, possibly never. I said, why? He said, he doesn't like CIOs. I said, why? Because they are proxies for their customer. They think they decide what the customer wants. And from that day, my attitude to being a CIO changed. I knew how much I had to get out of the way to reduce the distance between the developer and the customer so that real conversations take place. Now that is the job, going back to your first question, of CRM. If you think of CRM, that the words customer and relationship are actually valuable words and not just there to fill up space. You cannot define your customer relationship according to what you think. You have to define the customer relationship in terms of what the customer thinks. That's why when I have Amazon recommending books to me, I'm desperate to say, hey, Amazon, you own Abe Books. I buy half my books from Abe Books. Can't you make recommendations to me out of my Abe Books purchases as well? Can't I take the clickstream of purchases I make and make it an aggregate of all my purchases, not all your purchases, right? We have to design things for the, bait in business needs to be designed for the fish and not the fisherman, okay? A lot of our times when we talk about CRM, we are designing bait for the fisherman. The opportunity to go outside the walls of the organization is to start designing bait for the fish. Now, you may not like that analogy. It's not a perfect analogy. All I was trying to say was when you're designing a service for the customer, make sure that it's the customer that you're thinking about. It's that perspective, not yours.
Wonderful. Well, I think we can finish on that good note. I would like for you to give JP a round of applause.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Very inspiring. Very inspiring. Thank you so much.